Hi, my name is Eric J. Johnson. I'm the Associate Curator for Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Ohio State University Libraries here in Columbus, Ohio. We are here at the Jan and Jack Creighton Special Collections Reading Room, which the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library shares with a couple other divisions of the Ohio State University Library's Special Collections Department, Theater Research Institute Library, and the Hillendar Research Library. And I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about our collections, which are really rather expansive, and to give you a sense of what kinds of things we have by highlighting a few examples of things that I particularly like. Some of them are also just random off-the-cuff selections. The first item I'd like to talk about today is what I like to describe as my white whale. This is the Hornby Bible. This is probably, in my very biased opinion, one of the most substantial and beautiful items we have in the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library's collections. And what the Hornby Bible is an example of an early 13th century transitional Bible. And what I mean by that is prior to the early 13th century, medieval Bibles, by and large, did not look at all like Bibles as we think of them today. They tended to be in larger volumes, larger pages than even this, and to have a complete Bible, you likely would have had a Bible in a multi-volume set, usually anywhere between 6 to 20 or even more volumes. In the early 13th century, however, a number of intellectual and cultural changes were happening in Europe that necessitated the creation of a new type of Bible. And the Hornby Bible is a result of that. What happened in the early 13th century, to put things very, very simply, is that you had the emergence of the universities, and you had the emergence of the fraternal orders, or the orders of friars, the Dominicans and Franciscans. And let's take the universities first. With the rise of the universities, the Bible became essentially the core textbook for all fields of study. What they needed in that case, when a lot of people are trying to use the same text, is something that is standard, or as standard as possible during a period in which we do not have the mechanical reproduction of books. Everything is being written by hand. So what happens in the early 13th century is they start to develop new ways of packaging the Bible. The Bible starts to coalesce into a single volume, and you start having coherent and consistent ordering in the order of the books of the Bible, so beginning with Genesis and ending with Apocalypse. And other things begin to happen. Certain facets of the early medieval Bible start to fall out. So for instance, if you look at this leaf here, you can see all of these colored Roman numerals, these rubricated Roman numerals. This is what is called a capitula list. And this is an outline of the old chapter numbers that had been assigned to the Bible traditionally over the course of centuries in the early medieval period. In the early 13th century, what happens is these old capitula numbers start to fall out of fashion, and the Bible is re-chaptered, so to speak. It's reorganized. If we look at this leaf, we can see an example of this happening in the Hornby Bible itself. These colored numbers, these rubricated numbers in the margins, are the old traditional chapter numbers. However, we can see that these have been crossed out lightly by either plummet or ink. And then the new chapter numbers, so in this case, chapter 51 has been renumbered to chapter 22. We have one revision in ink and another revision in plummet, or early pencil. And what is going on here is that the old traditional chapter numbers are giving way to the new 13th century style of ordering the chapters of the Bible. And essentially, these chapter numbers are the same chapter numbers that we see now when we look at the Bible today. The Hornby Bible is extremely significant for a number of reasons. It was created, we don't know exactly when, but sometime between 1210 and 1220. And it survived intact until 1981, at which point it was tragically sold at auction and broken apart by its purchasers immediately. The leaves were then distributed for tax purposes and sold off piece by piece. Sometime in the early 1980s, Ohio State University came into possession through donation of roughly 150 to 160 of these leaves. And over the last few years, it has become somewhat of an obsession for me to try to piece together as many pieces of this Bible as possible. We are now sitting at approximately 100 or 181 leaves out of an original 440 leaves here at Ohio State. This one or actually these two, I should say, are our newest editions. This illuminated leaf features St. James the Less. We acquired this one in April, and the one right next to it with this gorgeous vinework illuminated P we acquired in May. And what I'm trying to do is reconstruct this Bible, not just because we already have a lot of it and it would be a nice thing to do, but because, for all intents and purposes, the different changes that we see working in this manuscript constitute, in what we would call in biological terms, a missing link. This is a fundamental step in the transition and the evolution of the medieval Bible from the early medieval period to what we now know and think of as the Bible. It's an extremely important witness to the textual production of the Bible, and I would encourage anyone, if any of these types of leaves look familiar, to please get in touch with Ohio State. You may have one on your wall. This is actually a late 14th century copy, probably from circa 1375, of Bernardo Gui's Speculum Sanctorale. And what this essentially is what's called a legendary, or a collection of saints' lives. The text itself, while significant, wasn't that popular, and the reason that we're showing it to you today is not because of what the words happen to say, but because of this little guy right here. And this is an original medieval bookmark. And as you can see, still bound in to the original binding. This is an original late 14th century binding in deerskin over boards. And what's significant about this is I don't have an exact census for you, but there are an extremely low number of these bookmarks that still survive. And most of those that do survive do not exist in their original books. They survive as single independent units. They're not on strings, they're not bound into their texts. But this is a significant and fun object for more reasons than the fact that it's extremely rare. This is what I really like to call an example of medieval hypertext. Books, as you can see, looking at this layout, could be pretty hard to read in the Middle Ages. You've got tightly packed, condensed text. The colors that are operating here are serving not just as decoration, but predominantly as punctuation. Modern punctuation systems didn't really develop as we know them now until the late 16th century. And so medieval readers and writers would employ these different colors in order to help them navigate their way through the text. In spite of any sort of help that these colors could give, however, the whole process of reading one of these books could be very, very difficult, so they created other forms of reader's aids, and this bookmark is an example of this, and I'll show you how it works right now. Step one, this is very much like any modern bound-in bookmark that we can think of today. It's on a string, and you just lay the string in, and it will mark your page opening. However, you'll notice that there are 4 columns of text on this page. Well, this would be primus, secundus, tertius, and quartus, the first, second, third, and fourth columns. If you take our bookmark, you'll notice one that it has a lovely little drawing on it, pen and ink drawing, and you'll notice that it spins. This is what's called a Volver bookmark. On the back, you have 4 words written: primus, secundus, tertius, and quartus. We'll drop this one, we'll stop it right there, and we'll mark it at quartus. Now, what this is telling us is the reader is on the 4th column. Not the first, second, third, but on the 4th column. So we have 2 steps: page opening, column marker. Now, I'm not going to do this because it's extremely fragile, but you'll notice this knot right here. This little knot just between my fingers is actually a noose of sorts, and it would allow you to move this bookmark up and down the string. And that would allow you to then not only mark the page opening in the column you're on, but the exact position within the column where you had stopped reading. This is a very, very creative way that medieval people developed in order to help them navigate their way through their texts. There are all sorts of other examples, but this one is probably the rarest one that we've got here at Ohio State, and it's a very, very popular feature of this late 14th century manuscript. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you out there, know who Martin Luther is. Martin Luther is considered the father of the modern Protestant church, all of its branches. And potted history of Martin Luther in the barest possible terms. Be 1517, Martin Luther hammers his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. And this essentially starts what is going to become a raging firestorm in the ecclesiastical landscape across Europe. Needless to say, the papal powers do not like Luther's challenge of papal authority. In particular, he's challenging the whole system of indulgences whereby people could buy time off from purgatory and buy forgiveness for their sins. And there's a lot of back and forth between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church during the next 2 to 3 years. Luther participates in a number of public disputations with Catholic authorities, and really no common ground is being met. And then in 1520, Luther essentially begins what becomes the final breaking between this new Protestant movement and the Roman Catholic Church. And he issues 3 texts. Ohio State has as I mentioned earlier, the Harold Grimm Reformation Collection. The Grimm Collection consists of over 600 different titles. We're probably approaching closer to 700, if not more at this stage. And it chronicles really every aspect of the German Reformation. And Ohio State is extremely lucky to have probably what could be considered the 3 core texts of the early German Protestant movement. These were all written by Martin Luther in 1520. This first text was August 1520, and this is Luther's address to the Christian nobility of the German nation. And in this book, Luther lays out a doctrine that will become one of the foundational tenets for all of Protestantism as the years go by, and that is the notion of the priesthood of all believers. And basically, in quick terms, what this doctrine dictates is that your personal relationship with God need not be mediated by priests. This charges all Christians to actually take their own salvation into their own hands. The second book next to it is De Captivitate Babylonica Ecclesiae, on the Babylonian captivity of the church. And this was probably Luther's most antagonistic text of the 1520s, or of the year of 1520, and this was issued in October 1520. And in this, Martin Luther essentially attacks the sacramental structure of the Roman Catholic Church. He pays particular attention to redefining the understanding of the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, baptism, and the doctrine of penance. Perhaps most antagonistically, however, this is the first printed occurrence of Luther actually calling the Pope, in this case Pope Leo X, the Antichrist. There's really no going back from that point. The third text is November 1520, and this is on the freedom of the Christian man. And in this text, here we have a nice little early woodcut portrait of Luther. In this text, we basically see Luther saying that the faithful Christian does not believe in God and does not love God because he is compelled. Rather, it's a free and willing demonstration of love and a free and willing pursuit of charity and right living, simply because you love God, not because you are compelled to love God.